Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
The UN Security Council is holding its second emergency meeting in a week as diplomats wrestle with what to do about North Korea's persistent weapons program. After the country successfully tested a hydrogen bomb, South Korea responded with fresh military drills, while the US pledged a massive military response if it or its allies were threatened. Meantime, China has criticised Donald Trump's threats to cut off trade with countries that deal with North Korea as unacceptable.
We keep stressing that we cannot solely rely on China to resolve this issue on the Korean Peninsula. It requires all sides to work together towards a shared goal. Under the current circumstances, we would like to call on all sides again to keep calm, meet each other halfway and strive together to bring back the issue to the correct track of peaceful resolution through dialogue and consultation.
Well, correspondent Siobhan Robbins is live in Washington for us this afternoon. Hello to you, Siobhan. We are waiting for the second emergency meeting from the UN Security Council in a week. What can they do?
Well, I've just seen the UK ambassador to the UN arrive at that meeting. Again, very tough words denouncing the actions of North Korea, which of course claims that it tested a hydrogen bomb over the weekend. But it's a good question. What exactly can they do? We've seen numerous meetings now by this council in response to North Korea, and they've already put in a raft of sanctions. Some would say those sanctions clearly aren't working, so what's the point? But certainly those people within the Security Council will argue, well, actually some of those rafts of sanctions have only just been implemented. They haven't been properly rolled out, so they need to take effect. But also they can go harder. They can look at squeezing North Korea even more, possibly trying to reduce things like food and oil, basically cutting off their energy supplies as well. So they'll be looking at squeezing North Korea in a way to try and make them stop. But others will say, has the diplomatic route run its course? And we know that certainly General Mattis, the Defense Secretary for the US, issued a very plain and measured warning to North Korea yesterday, essentially saying, we don't want to obliterate you, but if we have to, we will, if it means that we have to protect ourselves or our allies. And we know that Donald Trump has also said that although the diplomatic options are still on the table, he hasn't ruled out military or even nuclear options. Now, another route that the US looks to be going down is to try and put increasing economic pressure on North Korea, threatening that anyone who does trade with North Korea could be cut off. So it's hoped that that also would make Kim Jong-un more measured in his response. But the reality is it doesn't seem to be working. South Korea is reporting that it believes that North Korea will test another ballistic missile, possibly, or some type of missile this week, possibly before Saturday, and they're warning it could even be shot into the Pacific, possibly towards Guam.
And the trade bloc would impact on China. China not at all happy with this threat from Donald Trump. They say that is completely unacceptable. But the West is looking to China, which is, I was going to say the greatest, but probably the only ally of North Korea, to do something.
I don't think you can underestimate how important China is in this conflict. As you say, they are North Korea's only ally. They are the only ones who trade with North Korea. North Korea is also dependent on them for its energy. So China really has the strongest hand in this. Now, the suggestion that China could be totally cut off from trading with the US is an over-exaggeration and possibly a misspeak by Donald Trump, but he could target Chinese companies, individual companies that trade with North Korea, to try and stop them doing business, which could also squeeze North Korea. But North Korea is aware of this. They're very wise, and Kim Jong-un knows that in order for him to progress, he needs to try and drive a wedge between China and the US.
OK, for now, thanks so much indeed, Siobhan. Thank you. UN Security Council, heard from Siobhan there that the UK ambassador has arrived, the UK ambassador to the UN. We are waiting for that second emergency meeting in a week to get underway. What, if anything, can be done to try to stop the ballistic missiles that we are hearing about from North Korea from being launched for a 6th time. We'll stand by and find out. Meantime, live to the UN in New York, where a meeting of the Security Council is being held to discuss the latest nuclear test in North Korea.
The organization's monitoring stations had picked up an unusual seismic event in the area of the site used in the DPRK for its previous nuclear tests. The CTBTO's data indicated that the event measured approximately 6.0 in magnitude. Governmental sources from UN member states measured a yield as high as 6.3. In any case, it is evident the yield of the device was larger than any of the DPRK's previous nuclear tests. Experts have estimated a yield of between 50 and 100 kilotons, or on average, more than 5 times more powerful than the weapon detonated over Hiroshima and at the low end of the yield of a modern thermonuclear weapon. The CTBTO detected a second, smaller seismic event at the location of the DPRK test site 8.5 minutes after the main event. The CTBTO has not yet completed its analysis of the second event, but experts have speculated that it could have been caused by the collapse of the tunnel used in the nuclear test. Mr. President, in an earlier statement the same day, the DPRK official media reported that their leader had inspected what they claimed to be a hydrogen bomb, which was conspicuously displayed in front of a payload fairing for a Hwasong-14 intercontinental ballistic missile. The DPRK article stated that the hydrogen bomb was, quote, a multifunctional thermonuclear nuke with great destructive power, which can be detonated at even high altitudes for super powerful EMP attack, end quote. This was a rare reference by the DPRK to the use of EMP, an electromagnetic pulse, which, triggered by a nuclear weapon, would aim for widespread damage and disruption to electricity grids and sensitive electronics, including on satellites. Mr. President, this is the second Emergency Security Council meeting on nonproliferation, the DPRK, in less than a week, and the 10th time the Security Council has met to discuss the DPRK this year. On 31 August, the DPRK Foreign Ministry issued a statement to reject the Security Council's recent presidential statement and said that the ballistic missile launch of 29 August was the, quote, first step taken by the Korean People's Army in its Pacific operation and a meaningful prelude to restraining Guam, end quote. There are reports today indicating that the DPRK may be preparing new ballistic missile tests. Mr. President, we are alarmed by this dangerous provocation. The Secretary General condemns the underground nuclear test announced by the DPRK. This act is yet another serious breach of the DPRK's international obligations and undermines international nonproliferation and disarmament efforts. This act is also profoundly destabilizing for regional and international security. The DPRK is the only country that continues to break the norm against nuclear test explosions. The Secretary General reiterates his call on the DPRK leadership to cease such acts and to comply fully with its international obligations under relevant Security Council resolutions. Mr. President, the Secretary General counts on the Security Council to remain united and take appropriate action. As was said in the Security Council meeting last week, as tensions rise, so does the risk of misunderstanding, miscalculation, and escalation. The latest serious developments require a comprehensive response in order to break the cycle of provocations from the DPRK. Such a response must include wise and bold diplomacy to be effective. As the Council considers its reaction, the Secretary General reiterates the importance of responding to humanitarian imperatives regardless of the political situation. The people of the DPRK rely on the international community to provide humanitarian assistance to those in need. We will continue to follow the developments and remain in close coordination with the concerned international organizations, members of the Council, and other governments concerned. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Feldman for his briefing. I now give the floor to those Council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President, and we want to thank you for allowing us to have this prompt meeting as it's very urgent. And we also want to thank the Ambassador of Egypt and his team for the steady hand and the calm way in which he led in this past month. For more than 20 years, the Security Council has taken actions against North Korea's nuclear program. And for more than 20 years, North Korea has defied our collective voice. It's worth taking a few moments to recount some of the history. In 1993, the Council approved Resolution 825, calling on North Korea to remain in the Non-Proliferation Treaty. That didn't work. North Korea withdrew from the treaty and continued its nuclear pursuit. In 2006, the six-party talks faltered, and North Korea conducted several ballistic missile launches. That led to Resolution 1695, condemning them. The same year, North Korea conducted its first nuclear test. That led to Resolution 1718, establishing a UN sanctions regime aiming to stop all nuclear, ballistic missile, and other weapons of mass destruction programs. After six-party talks fell apart again in 2009, North Korea conducted additional missile launches and its second nuclear test. That led to Resolution 1874, which expanded sanctions, including an arms embargo and cargo inspection obligations. In 2012, the Leap Day deal failed, and North Korea conducted two new space launches. The Security Council responded with the adoption of Resolution 2087. Following North Korea's third nuclear test in 2013, the Council adopted Resolution 2094, expanding sanctions to restrict financial, maritime, aviation, and diplomatic activities. By 2016, North Korea had conducted its fourth nuclear test and another space launch. They followed that with more missile launches. In response, the Council adopted multiple resolutions expanding sanctions even further, targeting whole sectors of North Korea's economy. Finally, this year, the Council got even more serious. First, we adopted Resolution 2356, designating high-ranking North Korean government officials and the Military Strategic Rocket Forces Command for individual sanctions. Then, just last month, after the regime's first two ICBM launches, we adopted Resolution 2371, the strongest sanctions we have ever imposed on North Korea. That resolution banned North Korean exports of coal, iron, and seafood, and imposed several other measures that will significantly cut off the revenues needed to fund their nuclear program. Why did I take the time to go through this history? To make this point. The United Nations Security Council has spoken with unusual unity and consistency on North Korea. That's a good thing. Along the way, there have been problems with implementation, and the Council has at times been too slow and too weak. But this is not a situation in which we have allowed divisions among us to stop any action. Still, here we are. Despite our efforts over the past 24 years, the North Korean nuclear program is more advanced and more dangerous than ever. They now fire missiles over Japanese airspace. They now have ICBM capabilities. They now claim to have tested a hydrogen bomb. And just this morning, there are reports that the regime is preparing for yet another ICBM launch. To the members of the Security Council, I must say, enough is enough. We have taken an incremental approach, and despite the best of intentions, it has not worked. Members of this Council will no doubt urge negotiations and a return to talks. But as I've just outlined, we have engaged in numerous direct and multilateral talks with the North Korean regime, and time after time, they have not worked. The time for half measures in the Security Council is over. The time has come to exhaust all of our diplomatic means before it's too late. We must now adopt the strongest possible measures. Kim Jong-un's action cannot be seen as defensive. He wants to be acknowledged as a nuclear power. But being a nuclear power is not about using those terrible weapons to threaten others. Nuclear powers understand their responsibilities. Kim Jong-un shows no such understanding. His abusive use of missiles and his nuclear threats show that he is begging for war. War is never something the United States wants. We don't want it now. But our country's patience is not unlimited. We will defend our allies and our territory. The idea that some have suggested a so-called freeze for freeze is insulting. When a rogue regime has a nuclear weapon and an ICBM pointed at you, you do not take steps to lower your guard. No one would do that. We certainly won't. The time has come to exhaust all diplomatic means to end this crisis, and that means quickly enacting the strongest possible measures here in the UN Security Council. Only the strongest sanctions will enable us to resolve this problem through diplomacy. We have kicked the can down the road long enough. There is no more road left. This crisis goes well beyond the UN. The United States will look at every country that does business with North Korea as a country, and the United States will look at every country that does business with North Korea as a country that is giving aid to their reckless and dangerous nuclear intentions. And what we do on North Korea will have a real impact on how other outlaw nations who seek nuclear weapons choose to conduct themselves in the future. The stakes could not be higher. The urgency is now. 24 years of half measures and failed talks is enough. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States for her statement. I give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. We appreciate the Presidency's swift convening of this urgent briefing, jointly requested by the United States, Republic of Korea, France, UK, and Japan. We also appreciate the briefing by Mr. Feltman. Less than a week ago, the Security Council gathered to condemn the launch of the ballistic missile by North Korea, which flew over Japan. Yesterday, North Korea announced it had succeeded in miniaturizing the nuclear warhead to be attached to an ICBM. Only hours later, North Korea conducted the 6th nuclear test. Seen together, it is clear how belligerent and dangerous North Korean actions are and how it is not a problem just for North Koreans' neighbors, but for the entire international community. The Security Council must not waste any time in putting an end to such an outrageous and unacceptable challenge to the security and safety of the world. Regarding the nuclear testing, North Korea is the only one to have conducted nuclear tests in the 21st century. Almost exactly 1 year ago, North Korea conducted the 5th nuclear test, and the Council members were united in expressing condemnation in the strongest terms. The international community urged North Korea to stop, but North Korea poured precious resources to enhance nuclear capabilities. As a result, the 6th nuclear test exhibited a magnitude of explosion far greater than the previous one and has raised the threat to an unprecedented level. Regarding missile launches, the Security Council has adopted a stern presidential statement less than a week ago. I will not repeat the discussion, but let me just remind you that missile launches and nuclear tests are part and parcel of North Korea's nuclear development. Taken together, the threat it poses has entered truly a new level, more grave and imminent. This nuclear test by North Korea is a clear violation of the Security Council resolutions and is a brazen challenge to the international disarmament and non-proliferation regime centered on the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, NPT. It also violates Japan DPRK Pyongyang Declaration, as well as the joint statement of the six-party talks. Japan strongly condemns North Korea and has directly lodged a protest against North Korea. Japan welcomes the fact that many countries in the world, including members of the Council, as well as the Secretary General, Guterres, they have already issued statements strongly condemning North Korea. But beyond condemnation, the Security Council must act to stop North Korea from continuing down this road. We should make it clear to the North Koreans that continuation of the current policy will bring about serious consequences. We must put maximum pressure on North Korea to change its policy. It continues to be critically important for all the member states to faithfully implement the existing resolutions that have been unanimously adopted, including 2270, 2321, 2356 and 2371. But that is not sufficient. Japan stresses the need for the Council to adopt swiftly a new resolution with further robust sanction measures. In paragraph 29 of Resolution 2371, the Security Council expressed its, and I quote, determination to take further significant measures in the event of a further DPRK launch or nuclear test, end of quote. The Council must act on this determination accordingly. Japan is looking forward to continuing to work closely with all the members of the Council on this ever more urgent and grave threat to the peace and security of the world. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Japan for his statement. I give the floor to the representative of France.
Monsieur le Président, permettez-moi tout d'abord de remercier l'Égypte pour son excellente présidence du Conseil de sécurité le mois dernier et de féliciter l'Éthiopie, à travers vous, Monsieur le Président, pour avoir pris la présidence du Conseil ce mois. Vous pouvez naturellement compter sur le plein soutien de la France pour le mois à venir, qui s'annonce particulièrement chargé. Je vous remercie d'avoir convoqué cette réunion d'urgence à notre demande conjointe avec les États-Unis, le Royaume-Uni, la République de Corée et le Japon.
A moment as we hear from the French ambassador to the UN, speaking in his native tongue, of course. We heard from the US ambassador to the UN, not mincing her words at all, saying it's more dangerous and more advanced than ever, the threat from North Korea. That the US ambassador said to the UN, went on to say that the UN should adopt the strongest possible measures against North Korea. Kim is begging for war. Our patience is not unlimited, is what the ambassador had to say. Still waiting. And we also heard from the Japanese ambassador to the UN, who was basically agreeing wholeheartedly with what we heard from the US. We're still waiting to hear from both the UK and indeed, equally importantly, the South Korean ambassador as well. As soon as we get further information, of course, we will bring that to you.
Such tests against all international standards of behaviour. In addition, we have met many times in recent months following other North Korean provocations, most recently just last week in response to its reckless missile test over Japan. Yesterday's nuclear test explosion was by far the largest yet. Combined with the increasing range of its missiles, North Korea poses a threat not simply to its region, but truly to global peace and security. This latest test has been rightly condemned already by most of the governments represented here today. We have passed 8 sanctions resolutions on North Korea, the country is subject to the most stringent sanctions currently applied by this Council. And yet still, North Korea continues to put its illegal missile and nuclear programs ahead of international law, international security, and the will of this Council. This is a disturbing and unprecedented situation. Rarely has a state remained so defiant in the face of overwhelming international condemnation and repeated powerful rounds of sanctions. It is clear that existing sanctions applied by the Security Council on North Korea are having an effect. In particular, the measures against commodity exports and the financial sector applied since 2016 are making it harder and harder for Pyongyang to acquire the hard currency necessary to fund its program. Each day, that gets harder still, thanks to the efforts of many states around this table. Those who doubt this impact need only read the statements coming from the North Korean regime. They rail against the sanctions that we have placed upon them. But it is also clear that DPRK is uniquely willing to put their illicit programs ahead of the well-being of its people. Those people suffer appalling repression and struggle even to feed themselves. The leadership of North Korea has chosen this path of defiance at great cost. Faced with this unique threat to international peace and security, the Security Council must condemn this test and the entire North Korean nuclear and missile program. We continue to wish for a peaceful way forward. Dialogue will always be our end goal, but returning to dialogue without a serious sign of intent from Pyongyang would be a setup to failure. North Korea must change course to allow a return to dialogue. Were they to do so, the opportunity exists to end this crisis. Until that moment, we must stay the course on sanctions and continue, as the Secretary-General has called for, to present a united front. I said when we met last week that the United Kingdom believed a new UN Security Council resolution was required in response to North Korea's dangerous and illegal test flight of the missile over Japan. In light of yesterday's nuclear test, our resolve to act has increased still further. We must increase the pace of implementation of existing sanctions and work rapidly towards the adoption of a new and effective resolution. While continuing to enforce the measures this Council has already agreed, we should go further by taking steps to sever the funds on which the regime relies in order to pursue its illegal and destabilizing programs. And we should not least further restrict the unethical exploitation of North Korean workers overseas. Mr. President, North Korea has created a deeply dangerous and unstable situation. The United Kingdom will work with our partners on this Council and beyond to tackle the challenge. I urge all states to join us. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for his statement. I give the floor to the representative of China.
谢谢主席先生。9月3日，朝鲜民主主义人民共和国不顾国际社会普遍反对，无视
provisions of the Security Council conducted once again a nuclear test. The Chinese government resolutely opposes and strongly condemns the nuclear tests of DPRK in violation of the UN Security Council resolutions. Achieving the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula and maintaining the nuclear non-proliferation system and peace and stability in Northeast Asia, this is the firm stand of the Chinese government and also the general aspiration of the international community. We strongly urge the DPRK to face up squarely to the firm will of the international community on the issue of the denuclearization of the peninsula and earnestly abide by the relevant resolutions of the Council, stop taking actions that are wrong, deteriorating the situation and not in line with its own interests either, and truly return to the track of solving the issue through dialogue. The situation on the peninsula is deteriorating constantly as we speak, falling into a vicious circle. The peninsula issue must be resolved peacefully. China will never allow chaos and war on the peninsula. The parties concerned must strengthen their sense of urgency, take due responsibilities, play their due roles, take practical measures, make joint efforts together to ease the situation, restart the dialogue and talks, and prevent further deterioration of the situation on the peninsula. The proposal by China and Russia of a two-track approach which promotes the denuclearization of the peninsula and establishment of a peace mechanism in parallel, the suspension initiative which calls for the DPRK to suspend its nuclear and missile activities and for the United States and the Republic of Korea to suspend their large-scale military exercises, and the step-by-step conception from Russia are the basis on which both countries jointly proposed a roadmap to resolve the peninsula issue. This joint initiative by China and Russia is practical and feasible, aimed at addressing the most urgent security concerns of the parties concerned, easing the tension as soon as possible, preventing the escalation of the situation round after another round, achieving through dialogue the denuclearization of the peninsula and maintaining the peace and stability of the peninsula and the region. We hope that the parties concerned will seriously consider this and actively respond to it. China calls upon the international community to jointly and comprehensively and fully implement the relevant resolutions of the Security Council on DPRK, firmly push forward the goal of denuclearization of the peninsula, and firmly maintain the peace and stability of the peninsula. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of China for his statement. I give the floor to the representative. I thank the representative of China for his statement. I give the floor to the representative of Ukraine.
Mr. President, I thank Jeffrey Feltman for his briefing on this alarming issue, and the United States, Japan, and the Republic of Korea for initiating the Council's briefing today. The open format of our meeting is important.
Okay, we'll leave Ukraine for a moment, or certainly its representative at the UN Security Council's second emergency meeting in a week. Back to them very shortly. Interesting to hear what Russia has to say. China, the representative from China mentioning Russia just a short time ago, saying the situation on the Korean Peninsula is deteriorating. The UK calling for a new UN security resolution against North Korea. And the US representative to the UN saying more dangerous and more advanced than ever, the North Korean situation, that from the US ambassador, and that the UN Security Council should adopt the strongest possible measures against North Korea. He is begging for war. Our patience is not unlimited. Joining us live from Paris is Dr. John Nielsen-Wright, Senior Fellow for Northeast Asia at Chatham House and Senior Fellow at Cambridge University. Hello to you. Thank you for joining us on Sky News this afternoon. Tough talk there.
Yes, and not entirely unexpected. I mean, the Americans are, of course, going to quite rightly, along with their allies, point out the provocations coming from North Korea. And so it's no surprise that on the back of that nuclear test and the indications that the North Koreans may be about to launch yet another ICBM, the patience of the international community has worn pretty thin. But the different response from the Chinese and the Russians, calling for a dialogue and a peaceful resolution of the conflict, means that there has to be a question mark about how far the UN can go other than just these strong declarations in terms of actual substantive measures to try and bring the North Koreans to heel.
China is saying that the US is not without guilt in this, not least because of the suggestions over trade limitations, but also the military exercises that are going on with South Korea, and the fact that they are using or allowing Japan to use some of their shore-based missiles as well. So where is this leaving us? In a downward spiral?
Not necessarily. I mean, I just think in some respects, we haven't really moved very far forward in terms of international solutions to the current crisis. The fact that Donald Trump was hinting at the possibility of sanctions against all countries that do business with North Korea is, I think, a measure of, to a degree, the desperation of the Americans. They don't really have an adequate solution for dealing with the current crisis. Tough measures are needed. The most I think we can hope for is maybe that the Chinese might be willing to temporarily suspend supplies of oil to North Korea, although even that, I think, is potentially wishful thinking. One thing that we should keep in mind is that the evidence seems to suggest that the North Koreans have themselves been stockpiling oil supplies since April of this year in anticipation of just such a proposal. And so once again, we face the difficult problem that there isn't much that the international community can do to really deter Kim Jong-un and to slow down his persistent campaign to develop his WMD capacity.
Suggestions that workforce could be stopped from travelling from China, Russia, and other countries in the region as well to North Korea. But is that just dabbling? And also, how concerned are we about characters like Kim and Donald Trump?
I think going after the revenue that North Korean labourers, some 50,000 of them outside North Korea, send back to North Korea is probably quite an important and valuable step. It's not going to, however, stop the North Koreans. It's going to impose a bit of pain. On the point about the personalities involved, yes, I think we should take seriously the temperament of the two men most actively involved in this conflict. Kim Jong-un, of course, brutal, authoritarian, cruel, ruthless, intent on pursuing his own agenda, but not crazy, rational, I think, recognizes that his calibrated response, however provocative to the rest of the world, serves his interests. He's not about to attack his neighbors or the United States for that matter. Donald Trump, somewhat unpredictable, impulsive, thin-skinned, a little bit erratic. Just yesterday, of course, he was criticizing America's South Korean ally for so-called appeasement, a very curious approach at this time of maximum crisis to be undercutting one of your main regional allies. I think a lot of people hope that there is a more coordinated response by the White House and that the more sensible advisors to the president, such as Defense Secretary Mattis and others, are able to begin crafting a coordinated and effective strategy for dealing with the North.
Both sides are talking a big game at the moment, aren't they, Doctor? If there is another missile launch, we've already had 2 emergency meetings of the UN Security Council. We've already had some of the major players that we've heard within the last half an hour talking tough. Where do we go from here?
It's very hard to see, really. North Korea is able to set the agenda repeatedly. If it were to test another missile, the real question would be, where would it test it? What would it look like? How far would it travel? There's been some speculation that a more confident and arrogant Kim Jong-un might think he could get away with firing a missile in the direction of Guam, not to attack American territory, but to show that he could reach it. That would be potentially a critical development because the Americans have been very forthright in saying they will view such actions as an attack on America and would have to respond forcefully. My thought is that probably Kim Jong-un will continue testing, but not in quite such a dramatic fashion. He gets mileage with his own people, of course, by being able to act in this sort of belligerent way. It shores up his own legitimacy at home. I think ultimately there's going to have to be some form of talking with North Korea. But when that can take place is not immediately clear. One hopes that the Americans, together with other intermediaries, the Swiss, for example, have talked about getting involved as mediators, that the Americans are still keeping the door open to talks at some point with Pyongyang.
Yeah, looking at some of the books behind you as you're talking, Doctor. Going critical, let's hope not. We'll speak to you soon. Thanks very much indeed. Thank you. Obviously keeping an eye on what's happening at the UN Security Council. We've heard from China, we've heard from Japan, we've heard from the US, we've heard from the UK as well, Italy speaking just now. As soon as we get more information, we will, of course, update you further.
At the weekend, North Korea sent its most provocative message to date by testing what it claimed was a thermonuclear weapon. Today, the UN Security Council responded. US Ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, said that North Korea has slapped everybody in the face with its latest nuclear test and said that after 24 years of half measures, enough is enough. South Korea's defense ministry warned that Pyongyang may be preparing another missile launch, and it carried out missile tests of its own. Our Asia correspondent Jonathan Miller has the latest.
South Korea's turn to strut its stuff today on this precarious peninsula. Don't worry, it's not World War III just yet. This drill designed to strongly warn Pyongyang amid rising alarm that another intercontinental missile test by Kim Jong-un was imminent. The simulated target, North Korea's nuclear test site, F-15 fighter jets joining the show of force and practicing precision strikes. Kim Jong-un's detonation of what the North claims was a miniaturized thermonuclear device has sent seismic shockwaves around the world. In a stroke, the 33-year-old autocrat has exponentially boosted his deterrent capability, and having already proved he can deliver on his threats, his wily game of nuclear poker has paid off. He now has his royal flush. The dictator's dutiful subjects proudly said what they knew they had to say.
I think that this successful nuclear test shows the whole world that our sworn enemy, the US imperialists, are completely defeated. No power can stop us now that we are a strong nuclear state.
We will smash any kind of sanctions because we have single-hearted unity, and if the US imperialists try to play around with us, we will wipe them off the face of the earth.
Punitive, crippling sanctions aimed at further isolating the Kim regime under debate this morning as the UN Security Council met in emergency session.
His abusive use of missiles and his nuclear threats show that he is begging for war. War is never something the United States wants. We don't want it now. But our country's patience is not unlimited. We will defend our allies and our territory. We have kicked the can down the road long enough. There is no more road left.
With the White House mulling a massive military response, South Korea's Blue House, stung by President Trump's admonishment of what he called its appeasement of the North, called for max pressure on Pyongyang. The presidential spokesman said only more powerful sanctions would force Kim to negotiate. There's no doubt that China's got the greatest leverage. Xi Jinping, hosting a summit, today met Vladimir Putin. They are both opposed to the US flexing military muscle. A Chinese foreign ministry spokesman today called North Korea's nuclear test a mistake, which China resolutely opposed. China is also opposed to sanctions that might squeeze the recalcitrant dictatorship next door too hard. Trade with China is Pyongyang's life support, and Chinese oil keeps its factories ticking. Pyongyang propaganda boasts of the North's industrial prowess, but harsher UN sanctions will likely hit this hard. In China's view, a nuclear-armed despot is a lot less dangerous than regime collapse, which might lead to unification of the two Koreas, a US client state on the Chinese border. The timing of the nuclear test suggests it was less aimed at riling Trump than pushing China to get the Americans to talk to Kim, which he might now want now the nuclear playing field's more level. His country's newfound status as a thermonuclear power will be non-negotiable. Anyone still hoping for denuclearization is what Donald Trump might call a dreamer.
Jonathan Miller reporting. So What are the next moves for nations trying to deal with the increasing threat from North Korea's newfound long-range missile capability? Our Foreign Affairs correspondent, Jonathan Rugman, is here. Jonathan, what do we really know now, 36 hours after this detonation?
We don't know very much. The North Koreans say it was a hydrogen bomb. It was an underground test, so we don't know. We certainly know it was the biggest nuclear explosion the North Koreans have triggered. It was 8 times bigger than the Hiroshima explosion in 1945. The pictures that have appeared of Kim Jong-un with what the North Koreans say is a hydrogen bomb, well, they could be fakes. We just don't know whether that actual device is a decoy or not. What we can say is that North Korea has continued to be the only country in the 21st century which is carrying out nuclear tests in violation of both UN resolutions and international law.
Well, there's been this emergency UN session. Now the Americans can try to put together a worldwide sanctions effort against North Korea. But the Chinese, would they sign up to sanctions?
I didn't hear the Chinese ambassador to the UN even mention the word sanctions in his very terse contribution in the chamber this afternoon. There are already sanctions on coal, on iron, on seafood products, sanctions targeting North Korean officials. The Americans would love the Chinese to cut off oil exports to North Korea, but that would effectively leave the North Koreans freezing this winter, and I don't think that's going to happen. So the question is whether some kind of middle ground can be found, possibly stopping North Korean workers from sending back hard currency from overseas to North Korea. The problem is that the Chinese say they want dialogue, they want a freezing of all military activity on both sides of the Korean Peninsula, whereas the Americans and the British say, no, the North Koreans have to act first. Effectively, they have to suspend all their nuclear activity. Here's the British ambassador to the UN, Matthew Rycroft.
Dialogue will always be our end goal. But returning to dialogue without a serious sign of intent from Pyongyang would be a setup to failure. North Korea must change course to allow a return to dialogue. Were they to do so, the opportunity exists to end this crisis. Until that moment, we must stay the course on sanctions and continue, as the Secretary-General has called for, to present a united front.
Well, US Defense Secretary Mattis, General Mattis, and he's a military man, threatened a massive military response. What is the prospect?
Well, of course, President Trump said last month, he talked about fire and fury like the world has never seen. If you look at the pictures from April that we have of North Korean live fire exercises, you can see the kind of response that the North Koreans might mount if there was any kind of military action against North Korea. Yes, the Americans have been planning a preemptive strike, but what I'm hearing is that they have not concluded that such a strike would be possible and hit enough targets quickly enough to stop the kind of pictures, the kind of response that we've just seen from North Korea.
Jonathan Rugman. Krishnan.
Well, joining me now are the author and Chinese cultural commentator Diane Wei Liang and director of the SOAS China Institute at the University of London, Steve Sang. Diane Wei Liang, a lot of people are saying, why isn't China doing more? Why isn't China bringing this under control?
Well, China's in the, between a hard place and a rock, and China's influence over North Korea had deteriorated over the years. And China has a certain amount of influence, but is not determinant. And as this conflict, as we've seen, it's between North Korea and the United States. And China has always stated that it's dialogue that China wants. And there's no political interest for China to completely kill off supplies to North Korea. As we know, sanctions do not lead to regime change. It brings sufferings to ordinary people. And also, if China has a crazy neighbor as North Korea right next door, would you want to completely lose control, lose influence, whatever small amount you might have at the moment?
Steve Sang, is China as weak as that in this?
Well, China's influence in North Korea has certainly been falling, but ultimately China is not doing what it takes because it's not in the interest of the Communist Party of China to do so. The Chinese Communist Party approached Korea and foreign policy not first and foremost as a national security matter, but as a security of the Communist Party rule.
Just explain that. How does that work?
Now, most Chinese know, and the reality is that the North Korean regime can continue and survive because of Chinese support and subsidy. And they are the same type of regimes, Leninist regimes. So if the Communist Party of China allowed its dependent Leninist regimes in North Korea to collapse, it could be seen by dissidents in China that the Communist Party of China no longer has the will, determination, and capability to do whatever it takes to stay in power. Then things can get very difficult in China. And Xi Jinping said when he became leader, that's one thing that he will never allow.
But Diane, what will China do if America ratchets things up? I mean, if this rhetoric that we're hearing today in the UN Security Council starts being translated into action, if they start moving military assets into place and pondering some sort of action, will China just say, we can't get involved, really?
Of course, China will get involved. China borders North Korea. The refugees will be flooding into China, as the U.S. has said. They don't want a war. Neither does China. In fact,
so what will they do if it gets to that?
China's hoping it would not get to that. And China's been calling for dialogue. As we've seen, this escalation of conflict has not worked. It's a monthly reoccurrence. North Korea will test a missile, and the U.S. will threaten a war. It just goes on. Clearly, that does not work. And China, it has been pushing for dialogue. And of course, China will get involved. But China is not supporting the Trump policy because China, on one hand, doesn't think it works. On second hand, it's not in its interest.
Well, Steve's saying, I mean, Washington also sees the Chinese call for dialogue as something of a humiliation. They're saying, you've got to act as if you're equals. And Washington's position is, no, we're the United States of America, and they are the rogue state of North Korea.
Well, Mr. Kim does pose a big problem for the Chinese, but he can do so because Mr. Kim understands that ultimately President Xi does not want to see his regime implode. And that is one thing that gives the Kim regimes the confidence to poke the Americans in the left eye and then go back and poke the Chinese on the right eye and get away with it. If the North Koreans believe the Chinese are prepared and willing to see the North Korean regime implode, then they may have to think twice.
Just in a word, both of you, I mean, do you think this will come back from the brink of war?
I don't think we are close to war yet.
Okay, Diane?
I don't think we're at that point yet. It's the rhetoric so far.
Thank you both very much.
Country after country use language they've rarely used before at the United Nations today, but it is still difficult to avoid the sense tonight that attempts to bring North Korea into line are becoming ever more desperate. America, Britain, Japan led calls for tougher sanctions, but on the Korean peninsula itself, the realities of North Korea's latest nuclear bomb test are getting much too close for comfort. South Korea's response today was a huge live fire exercise, apparently meant to stimulate a strike on a North Korean nuclear facility. But it was also interpreted by many as a sharp reminder to Donald Trump of which country stands to lose most if the North does go to war.
At dawn this morning, South Korea's fighter jets rehearsed a precision strike, simulating an attack on North Korea. And on the east coast, ballistic missiles were launched as a warning to Kim Jong-un that its neighbour was ready to retaliate. But for now, at least, it was no more than a show of force. The government in Seoul pledging to support tougher sanctions.
We must step up sanctions and pressure until North Korea comes to the negotiating table.
North Korea is celebrating the success of its 6th nuclear test. Kim Jong-un hailed as the mastermind behind the country's advancing weapons program. And in a withering tirade in his regime's state media, this warning was issued to South Korea. If we fire, they will die. This is the inescapable fate of the puppet warmongers. If they pretend to be brave, they would not save their skins, as they have neither measure nor capability to cope with the ensuing consequences. In the hail of rhetoric being exchanged, China reacted angrily to a threat from President Trump that he would stop trading with the country if it did not rein in its so-called ally.
We are working to resolve this issue peacefully, but our own interests are subject to sanctions and jeopardized. This is neither objective nor fair.
There was no sign of impending doom in Seoul this evening. People here live with a constant threat from across the border.
I can say that normal Korean people don't really worry about those Korean behavior because they are always like that.
Not feel serious, but worry about it, yeah.
The South Korean Air Force is primed for a conflict it's hoped will never happen. Debbie Edward, News at 10, Seoul.
The UN emergency session was called because of the nature of yesterday's bomb test, 10 times more powerful than previous ones. The North claimed it was an H-bomb ready for use on a ballistic missile. America led the way at the emergency session by saying North Korea is begging for war and calling on the UN to impose tough sanctions before it is too late. Meanwhile, China, in a distinctly double-edged warning, said it would not allow chaos and war on the Korean peninsula. We'll be talking to our China correspondent in a moment to assess what they might really be thinking at this point. All in all, though, it was a sobering UN session today, as much for what it might not achieve as for what it might.
This morning for the 10th time this year, but certainly with increased urgency, the Security Council discussed how to change both the decision-making and the behavior of the North Korean regime.
The time for half measures in the Security Council is over.
The US ambassador warned that Pyongyang is now actively seeking conflict.
His abusive use of missiles and his nuclear threats show that he is begging for war. War is never something the United States wants. We don't want it now. But our country's patience is not unlimited. We will defend our allies and our territory. To the members of the Security Council, I must say, enough is enough.
Other powers, including Britain, want to pressure North Korea while keeping diplomatic options visibly on the table.
We continue to wish for a peaceful way forward. Dialogue will always be our end goal. But returning to dialogue without a serious sign of intent from Pyongyang would be a setup to failure.
But the key player, perhaps the only nation with influence over North Korea, is China. And Beijing is showing little appetite for tougher sanctions. South Korea says Kim Jong-un must now make a simple choice.
Whether to stick to its current path of self-destruction or redirect itself towards the path of survival is entirely the choice of North Korea.
Perhaps the greatest single mystery is what Kim Jong-un's ultimate motive is. Does a 33-year-old dictator see a thermonuclear device and ballistic missiles as the ultimate insurance policy against invasion? Or might he use them in a first strike against his perceived enemies? In Washington, President Trump is sending out conflicting signals, and yesterday had this vague response to a question about his intentions.
Mr. President, will you attack North Korea?
We'll see, was his barely audible answer. But North Korea's military prowess, with its vast number of artillery and missile batteries, means a preemptive strike by the US seems unlikely. For then South Korea would be the target of massive retaliation, and Seoul could face devastation.
And we'll speak to Robert in Washington in a moment. But first, let's go to Debbie Edward, who is in Seoul. Debbie, I don't know if you heard Robert saying there that it's the Americans' view that only China can stop this. What's your own view of what really the Chinese are thinking at this point?
Well, China utterly rejects the suggestion that it is somehow the key to solving this current crisis. China, first and foremost, is seeking to protect its own interests, and as far as it is concerned, it is doing all it can by introducing the latest round of UN sanctions, sanctions that were tougher than Beijing had planned to agree to. So you certainly won't see the Chinese signing up to any further economic embargo that's being suggested by South Korea, Japan and the United Kingdom. China has said that yes.
OK, very sadly, we've lost Debbie in Seoul. If we can, we'll try and go back to her. But let's go over to Robert and maybe pick that up. Robert, I don't know if you heard that. Debbie was just basically saying that the Chinese utterly reject the notion that they're the answer to all this. So what is the answer? I mean, can the UN do more? And if it did pass any more sanctions, would they make any difference at this point?
Well, Tom, I mean, certainly the Americans are aiming for another UN Security Council resolution, potentially by next Monday. It could, for example, tighten sanctions and could even impose an oil embargo. But it's not at all clear that Beijing or Moscow, for that matter, would be on board for that. I mean, both China and Russia today made very clear that their priority on the Korean Peninsula is to avoid war and chaos, not necessarily to put so much pressure on the regime of Kim Jong-un that it simply implodes. I think separately, though, for the White House, the crisis is really one of consistency and credibility. We know that President Trump has recently said that North Korea could face the fire and fury of the US military, but on the other hand, General Mattis, the US Defense Secretary, has said that in his view, war on the Korean Peninsula would be tragic on an unbelievable scale. So in other words, you know, if you're a regional ally like South Korea or Japan, there's no clarity on what American strategy is at a time of great unpredictability.
OK, Robert, thank you very much. And unfortunately, we can't make it back to Debbie in Seoul, so we will pick up on this tomorrow.
In a crisis where language is critical, the US ambassador to the UN told a Security Council meeting today that North Korea's test yesterday of a suspected advanced hydrogen bomb showed Kim Jong-un was begging for war. Today, America and South Korea agreed to scrap a warhead limit on South Korea's arsenal, enabling it to strike North Korea with greater force in the event of a military conflict. As if to emphasize the scaling up, South Korea earlier carried out a simulated attack on North Korea's nuclear test site. The US Defense Secretary James Mattis warned Pyongyang of a massive military response. Amidst the deafening din of international diplomacy, what do we know about the 33-year-old whom some believe has pushed the world the closest it's come in years to nuclear conflict? Here's our diplomatic editor, Mark Urban, on what we know about Kim Jong-un.
Kim Jong-un, ringmaster of the North Korean circus, subject of public adulation. But a man who apparently has ordered generals who didn't applaud enthusiastically enough to be executed, killed his own brother, and now forges ahead with nuclear weapons, even if it threatens to impoverish his nation. Yet, a man also who those who meet often take to.
People I know who have met him describe a really quite affable young man, a nice sense of humour, very easy to be with, very, very affable in all kinds of ways. Very much a family man, devoted to his wife and his children, a man who enjoys the nice things in life. He entertains personal guests on his luxury yacht, usually moored up near the western port of Wonsan, and likes nice food, nice drink. Meets foreigners. Kim Jong-il never did. On New Year's Day, every foreign ambassador in Pyongyang gets to shake Kim Jong-un's hand. That never happened under Kim Jong-il.
Emerging from the slaughter of the Korean War, the leader Kim Il-sung built a personality cult around himself. He also began an almost obsessive ideological quest for juche, or self-reliance. In the 50s or 60s, that meant developing national industries, avoiding dependence on others, even allies, and limiting trade. Long-term, one can see in this obsession with national independence a quest that would eventually lead to ballistic missile and nuclear weapons development. The succession in 1994 of Kim Jong-il, Kim Il-sung's son and present leader Jong-un's father, made the dynastic character of the North Korean regime clear. And inevitably, that bred a preoccupation with eradicating challengers either in the party or within different branches of the Kim family.
The first transition wasn't easy and very nearly didn't happen at all. It certainly was not a given that Kim Jong-il was going to take over from Kim Il-sung, and there was a long gestation and quite a lot of infighting before he got the top job. By the time it came to the second transition, it was done in a hurry because, of course, Kim Jong-il died quickly of a stroke, we believe, heart attacks, but he had a series of medical conditions. And it doesn't look as if there was much time to put in order what we in the West might call an orderly succession.
It was in the early 2000s that Kim Jong-il's pursuit of nuclear weapons became, in the view of many working the problem, unstoppable.
The North Koreans saw what happened to Muammar Gaddafi after he gave up his nuclear weapons program. They saw what happened to Saddam when he didn't have nuclear weapons. So they drew the conclusion that nuclear weapons are necessary for regime survival.
In 1997, Kim Jong-il sent his son under an assumed name to an international school near the Swiss capital of Bern. Kim Jong-un spent 4 years there. The North Korean ambassador attended parents' evenings in loco parentis, and classmates remember his love of pizza, basketball and American pop. Ascending to the leadership in 2010, Kim Jong-un pursued his boyhood idols, inviting them to visit him in Pyongyang.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday.
But this youthful leader remained mindful of the threat his older brother Nam, once heir apparent but latterly living discreetly in Macau, could pose. Last year, Jong Nam was assassinated in Malaysia by killers using a nerve agent. Dispensing with internal challenges, Kim Jong-un calculated that external threats would be best countered by speeding up the missile and nuclear weapons program. And he ignored friendly Chinese advice, Donald Trump's threats and UN sanctions alike.
It's not just a vanity. It's, first of all, it's seen as what is necessary to preserve the regime. It's partly a matter of this is what North Korea can do. This is all that North Korea can do, is produce weapons that go boom. In every other field of endeavor, they are way, way behind the South Koreans, and the people of North Korea increasingly know that, be it economics or energy or industry or science. The South Koreans are way, way far ahead. So building nuclear weapons and missiles is something that makes the North Koreans feel that that they are in the big leagues, that they are they can compete with the South, and that's a powerful motivation not to give it up.
Many now regard nuclear weapons as the indispensable prop of the North Korean regime. But it wasn't always that way. In the mid-90s, they were ready to shelve the whole project as part of an international agreement. So what changed? Well, an American-sponsored program of regime change in the Middle East. For one thing, George W. Bush was too distracted by Iraq and Al-Qaeda to pursue the North Korean issue, and Barack Obama similarly got fixated on the possibility of a deal with Iran, while the North Korean pot boiled away.
For a leader still only 33, The pursuit of nuclear weapons has validated his grandfather's ideology of self-reliance and demonstrated the impotence of the United States. The main question now is whether Kim Jong-un knows how to de-escalate this crisis.
Mark Urban, well, as recently as a few weeks ago, perceived wisdom in many Western capitals was that North Korea was several years away from developing long-range nuclear weapons. In the last fortnight, Pyongyang has shown it has long-range missiles and appears to have hydrogen bombs. Whether it's yet found the technology to combine the two is unknown, but how do they do it so quickly? And why didn't the predecessors of the current administration in Washington spot it was happening? Laura Rosenberger served under President Obama as National Security Council Director for China and Korea. She also worked on North Korean issues at the State Department under George W. Bush, and she joins us now. Good evening to you. First of all, thanks. Why didn't you see this coming under George W. Bush? Was Mark Urban's analysis right that his eyes were too firmly on the Middle East to worry about what Kim Jong-un was doing and his father was doing?
You know, I think that there's a complicated series of dynamics, many of which were highlighted in that piece. I do think, of course, you know, the Bush administration, the Clinton administration before it, the Obama administration after it, was very focused on this challenge. When I was working at the State Department under the Bush administration, I actually worked on negotiations with the North Koreans. We actually had a program at the time that was beginning to take apart their nuclear complex. That deal fell apart for a variety of reasons. I think one of the things that's really important to note in this, that was highlighted in the film, is in fact that Kim Jong-un is very different than his father and his grandfather. Doesn't respond in the same ways.
But in fact, in a sense, was intelligence in America poor not to recognize that? And was Obama actually too soft?
You know, I think that that American analysts and many around the world, it took a while to get an understanding of how Kim Jong-un was behaving differently than his father and his grandfather. He doesn't respond to the same kind of external inducements that his father and grandfather did. He's been very singularly focused on obtaining this program. And I think, you know, there's absolutely no question that what has been done to date has not worked. We would not be here if that were different. And that's why I think it's so critical that we need to get this right at this really, really dangerous point in time.
And who is most likely to get that right? Is it the Chinese?
You know, the Chinese absolutely play an important role here, and they do have a good bit of economic leverage on the North Koreans. But the Chinese interests are always going to be different than the U.S. interests, than the interests of Seoul and Tokyo and of most of our European allies. China's only going to be willing to go so far, and this is not a problem that could be simply outsourced. It requires American leadership and a global coalition.
Right. Let me just talk to you about the technology here. Who do you think is helping Kim Jong-un get the technology that he's clearly developing quickly?
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's details I can't speak to, but I think that you know, there's been a good bit of reporting about some of the sources for a variety of supplies for their nuclear and missile programs, including technology coming through and from China. You know, there have been conflicting reports about where the engine parts have come from. But the reality is, too, that North Korea has developed a good bit of this internally, using financial support that they've been obtaining from different places. And so I think that what's really important is cutting off both the money and the materials that are helping to support the growth of this program.
Now, in one of the articles you wrote earlier in the summer, and you talked very firmly about language, and you've looked at language patterns, and if you looked at the kind of language that Kim Jong-un has used in the past, but you also said, asked the question, could Trump tweet us into a nuclear war? Now, you know, Trump has inherited this problem, but do you give a sense that actually he's making it worse?
I have to credit the headline writers with that particular headline. But I do think, of course, that language is incredibly important in these kinds of scenarios. One of the most important things in managing the situation with North Korea is our deterrence. And deterrence is coupled with reassurance for our allies. Both of those depend on credibility of our words. Our allies knowing that our commitments are ironclad when we say that we will defend Seoul or Tokyo if they are attacked. our credibility in our words to Pyongyang, that they know when we say we will act, that we will. And what I worry about is that some of the very uncoordinated language that we are seeing out of this administration, and particularly the very hot rhetoric from the president, could be sending signals that could be misinterpreted. And I worry that could lead to some kind of miscalculation.
Thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Daily Mirror's Kevin Maguire, Daily Mail's Andrew Pearce are here. To The Guardian and other newspapers who are leading on the begging for war line that came out of the United Nations today via the United States.
Yeah, Nikki Haley, US ambassador, war of words, very belligerent, bellicose herself. I'm not sure this particularly helps, particularly after the Defence Secretary in the States, James Mattis, has talked about the possibility of total annihilation of 22 million people in North Korea. Kim Jong-un is a paranoid, crazy person that's somehow got to be stopped with his rocket development and nuclear development. And I'm not sure playing this game is going to do it. And you want calm, cool heads in a crisis, not people talking up like this. You're going to have to put in sanctions, hope China can be persuaded to intervene more directly and somehow try and stop him developing these weapons, which we don't want him to have, although it's got to be pointed out we're about to spend 200 billion quid on our own weapons of mass destruction.
It is all about China. China has the power to enforce an almost absolute economic blockade on North Korea. That could potentially unseat the lunatic. They'll be worried, of course, if the whole regime toppled, what comes next. And also, of course, but what they want to avoid, apart from the nuclear Armageddon, is they do not want a great influx of refugees flooding into China.
But the way to get China on board is surely not to criticise them via Twitter and make them feel like they have to kowtow to whatever America wants to do.
And they won't do that, particularly as they've got their big 5-year, was it their 5-year when
Communist convention?
Yes, where he's the leader.
It's like a meeting of the House of Lords, really.
Yes,
That's just think of it that way.
There'll be no men there. There'll be no women there, rather. There'll probably be one woman serving the tea. But so it's a delicate tightrope. But I think that UN ambassador who talked the tough talk, I think she knows what she's doing,
She talks the tough talk because she's been told to say what she says via Trump, or not?
Well, I think she's been there quite a while. She knows her way round. I mean, and also there are some good, strong people around Trump now. I would have been more worried if people like Steve Bannon were there. But of course, Steve Bannon, who's now gone, had said there is no military option.
Is Kim Jong really begging for war?
No,
I don't think so. So why say it? Because you're doing it so you can say he begged, so we gave him his war. Got to somehow deal with this person, this hereditary communist dictator there. He's got to be dealt with. But certainly, the point you made, America just talks down to China. You can't talk down to China. China's a superpower. It's a huge economy. It'll overtake America in size soon if it hasn't already. You've got to listen to China. For instance, China says, if we're going to try and get Kim Jong-un to cease his missile and nuclear development, halt American and South Korean military exercises in the region. Now, of course, that would suit China too, which wants to be a bigger player there, although I always think you send American warships off the coast of China or pretty close to China. How would America feel if Chinese warships were off the coast of America? We've got to look at it from Chinese eyes in order to get them involved, because we know they're concerned, and they're quite rightly concerned, because it is on their doorstep. Anything that happens, they will feel the brunt of it. We'll feel tremors here in Europe and in the States, but in truth, his missiles can't go that far. The refugees wouldn't come here. They would go into China.
Just take him out.
But that's a kind of...
He took out his brother. He took out his brother. It was done very easily. We watched it happen in an airport.
Do you not think that's what he's done? He's looked at Iraq, where Saddam Hussein was so-called taken out. Muammar Gaddafi was taken out and ends up in a ditch, killed by a mob. Do you not think he's thinking, I'll get nuclear weapons in order to stop that happening?
Then you can't... And yes, hang on. If you talk how Britain needs him as a deterrent to stop being attacked, why can't he talk the same? I mean, this is a problem. We haven't really got the moral authority when we're spending that £200 billion upgrading Trident II and getting better weapons of mass destruction, more explosive weapons of destruction. But then, well, it might be Labour Party policy. I think it's a bad policy.
Normally slavishly follow Labour Party policy.
But you then say to him, don't get him. You've got to follow the logic of your argument there.
Like the man in North Korea has weapons. We need ours.
You don't want proliferation. You want countries to be giving up these weapons.
I've been